Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 20th, 2024. I want to talk about the legacy of British geopolitics and why you have to understand that legacy to realize why it is that the West is continuing to push for a war and why there was no consideration whatsoever from the United States or from Europe for the proposal made by President Putin for a peace agreement. Putin gave his proposal on June 14th to end the war. It was a fairly detailed proposal which included a whole discussion of what caused the war and why his approach would work. But his proposal was for not just Ukraine, ending the war with Ukraine, but for a broader global security. And it was presented as Russia's position for a peace agreement, but for negotiation, as a basis for a diplomatic settlement. Now, when it was rejected by Biden, Schultz, and others, including Stoltenberg, they basically said, no diplomacy, no negotiation. You surrender or there'll be more war. And NATO will gear up for that war relentlessly. So no dialogue at all, just demands coming from the West. Now, if you review Putin's proposal, you see why they rejected it. Because they're responding based on the inherited axioms of British imperial policy. Putin proposed the Eurasian security architecture to take into account the security interests of all of Eurasia. And those interests primarily include economic policies that are for the benefit of each nation. What Putin said is this is not exclusively for Eurasia. He would welcome the presence of NATO members in it. That is a broad economic space from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And that this goes back to proposals from the beginning of the 20th century of the Trans-Siberian Railroad and other such ideas. Now, the idea is you have one joint economic development area, which would be in the interests of all of the members that live in that area. And this would include an economic partnership with North Korea, which is where Putin was the last couple of days. It's centered around the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative of China, that you set up transport corridors of development that connect nations, not merely for trade, but also for culture, for the communication of ideas among peoples. Now, this is what's being built into the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and along with it, a move for a new settlement agreement on balance of trade payments and so on outside of the dollar, because the dollar is no longer trusted by these nations, given the sanctions policy and the theft of assets by Western banks. So this is a move not just for peace in Ukraine, but a change in the whole strategic relationship and a move toward an economic development partnership among nations. Now, that's what the unipolar order geopoliticians object to. And they object to it based on a historic understanding of what it means. And they're seeing that they're losing control. The fact that the Saudis just decided to end the petrodollar agreement, a 50-year-old agreement, and instead throw their lot fully in with the BRICS countries, is a blow to the whole plan of the Biden administration of having a Saudi-Israeli alliance to break up the potential of the BRICS in Southwest Asia. The idea of replacing the SWIFT system. It takes away power and control of the City of London and Wall Street banks. Possibility of a new currency. They're not there yet, but they're looking at various options. They're trying things out. Maybe we'll see something as an experiment by the October BRICS meeting. But the whole Western world is jittery because the Western world has a pile of debt and a declining physical economy. And they're losing their power to dictate terms to the global South. Now, That's where you have to look at British geopolitics to get a sense of what they fear. Just look at the 19th century. The British Empire was active all over the globe, trying to intervene on behalf of the South in the U.S. Civil War, the two opium wars against China, the Great Game in Afghanistan against Russia, and there was the Crimean War from 1853 to 56, as well as the British efforts to sustain control over the Indian subcontinent, which meant eventually moving into Southwest Asia, what we call the Middle East, because these were the crossroads. And this was the area that the British knew was necessary for them to control to keep other empires or other competitors out of their territory. So this was the British outlook at the turn of the century. Now, it was articulated by Halford Mackinder in 1904 at the Royal Geographical Society in his famous geographical pivot speech. But essentially, this incorporated a couple of ideas. One is no German-Russian alliance could be allowed. He put forward this is when he first put forward the heartland theory. You cannot allow a unified policy for Eurasia. And this was the basis of the breakup of a Russian, German, French alliance looking to the east and replacing it with a wartime alliance of France, Britain, and Russia against Germany. Now, after World War I, Mackinder became more specific in what he wrote. And he wrote the following idea as the basis for a global imperial order. Point number one, who rules Eastern Europe commands the heartland. The heartland being essentially the center from the eastern, from European Russia to the Urals, and the area extending beyond that into Central Europe. Then secondly, he said, who rules the heartland commands the world island. And what was the world island? The interlinked area of Africa, Asia, and Europe, which is where you see the importance of the so-called Middle East, the crossroads that could lead you from Asia into Europe and into Africa, and later on with the discovery of oil and so on, as well as the trade routes. This was the center of the theory. So who commands Eastern Europe commands the heartland. Who commands the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world, Mackinder wrote. Again, the central idea was keep Germany and Russia apart and don't allow any alliances that connect European Russia with the rest of Asia. Now, this became the basis of Brzezinski and his ideas as he laid out in a 1997 article in Foreign Affairs called A Geostrategy for Asia. I'm just going to read you a couple of quotes from that because it will give you a sense of both the continuity with Mackinder as well as the policy today. He wrote, America's emergence as the sole global superpower now makes an integrated and comprehensive strategy for Eurasia imperative. That is, for the United States. He said that America is the indispensable nation, but a benign American hegemony must still discourage others from posing a challenge, particularly in Eurasia. And then he goes on to say, Europe is America's essential geopolitical bridgehead in Eurasia. And for this to work, he calls for an enlarged NATO, which will serve the short-term and longer-term interests of U.S. policy. And he goes on to say that Ukraine should be brought into the European Union and NATO. So here you see the extension of Mackinder's geopolitical ideas into Brzezinski's geopolitics. And this is what's shaping the policies of Sullivan and Blinken, who are proteges of Brzezinski through, in a certain way, Madeleine Albright. And what do they say for Russia? Brzezinski said Russia should be a loosely confederated Russia, a decentralized Russia. Why? So that it can be looted, so that its raw materials can be made available to private corporate interests in the West. That's why they reject negotiating with Putin, because they see that a concession on the idea of a unified Eurasia means ultimately the demise of control of the imperial geopolitical doctrine, which is an essential feature of this current neo-colonial world, which is collapsing. It's not a fight for democracy in Ukraine, but to weaken Russia and to sustain the power of a unipolar order. Now, this was discussed between Helga Zepp-LaRouche and myself yesterday. The dialogue we had, the weekly webcast, will be attached in the description section for you to listen to. And I'm also going to include a link for this Friday's International Peace Coalition event. Bring a friend. Log on. It's Friday, 11 a.m. I think it is. It has the time. Yeah, it's 11 a.m. But it will give you an opportunity to participate in a discussion with experts on how to resolve this problem and get us outside of the world dominated by British geopolitical doctrine. So thanks for joining me. By the way, tomorrow's Friday. Send me your questions at harleysch@gmail.com.